Chapter 4, Part 3. Far from disengaged, Vera always appeared alert and intent, making eye contact with me and other group members. If we gave her ample time, she would offer a word or two to the discussion. When the group learned that she loved cats, we began to incorporate feline-themed pictures and poems into our meetings, which made Vera smile. I remember her son's shock when he visited from out of town and found his mother participating in the group. Auguste Detour, Dr. Alzheimer's patient, supposedly exhibited psychosocial incompetence, which was one definition of dementia at the time. But I have read Dr. Alzheimer's interviews with her, and I do not find Auguste incompetent. I find a person pregnant with psychosocial longing, with desire. As she repeats her name, Auguste, Auguste, I hear her sensitivity to her own person and the threats to her personhood. When she repeats so anxious, as the doctor questions her, I sense an emotional awareness. She knows something is amiss. When Alzheimer asks her on what street she lives, Auguste answers, well, this is Frankfurt on Main, revealing her perception of her general place. Her anguished, I have lost myself, reveals a biting sense of self, I, myself, and her feelings of grief during her examination. When she was brought from the isolation room to the bed, she became agitated, screamed, was not cooperative, showed great fear, and repeated, I will not be cut. I do not cut myself. I can think of no more appropriate response than terrific fear of bodily and psychological violence, given she had been kept in the isolation room, only to emerge in a strange place to a probing male stranger. In the midst of Auguste's mental deficiencies, many of her expressions, the feelings behind them, make good emotional and psychosocial sense. Yet the doctor sees them as defective, just another manifestation of his disease. The treatment of Auguste Detour evidences a clinical, distant, depersonalizing approach to dementia. It centralizes mental tests that make little account for symbolic language, the motions of the body, or the intimations of desire. Tests that fail to examine how the examiner impacts the patient's response. She is an empty person, a patient only, a peculiar case of brain disease, devoid of psychosocial competence. Auguste Detour died on April 8, 1906, at age 55, from blood poisoning due to an infected bedsore, lying in bed in a fetal position, completely pathetic, incontinent, reports Alzheimer in his 1907 article. I understand the comfort that may abide in the notion of vacuity in absenting the diseased person as a gesture towards compassion. I did not want my grandfather or any of the residents in the gardens to suffer as their conditions progressed. If personhood is gone in the late stages of dementia, then they are spared any grief that may come from an awareness of both their own dying and the anguish of those around them. Given the unknowns of the subjective experiences of persons with severe dementia, I see the consolation in imagining blankness for them, especially if the alternative is torment. If we envision the person as either moving toward emptiness or anguish, vacancy will win out every time as the more humane vision. But too often, we confine individuals with dementia to these two options, reducing persons in all their intricacies in order to fit them into this schema. The geography of the inner world defies such orderly mapping. We flatten the soul's contours when we persist in imagining only polarities. A vision of vacancy, a death before death, may offer solace to individual caregivers, but in the end, it serves to oversimplify dementia experiences and to remove people from full moral accountability, which has troubling connections to other historic injustices. Drawing upon her experience as an African American, Leila Knox Shanks, in her 1996 memoir about caregiving for her husband, Hughes, resists the notion he is anything but fully human throughout his dementia. One reason slavery endured for so long in America was that some proponents promoted the idea that Africans had no souls. She writes, "It is a dangerous and degenerate society that engages in the dehumanization of any segment of its population, but if the mind has not left, but has changed, morphed into something unsettling and unpredictable, then we must make our response. We can cover the dead, or those presumed to be gone, in a nostalgic haze, talk of them in the past tense. The mad must be regarded in the undomesticated present. What if we defied vacancy's tyranny and returned to madness for a moment, not as a demon possession or constraint, or a way to classify and contain people, but as a needful folly in a world of stifling convention? Vacancy seems to suppress imagination. Madness stirs it. Might we direct those notions toward compassion? Madness, understood as a window on a social world less ruled by mental conformity, might have some salvageable meanings for dementia. Metaphors, our enduring need for enchantment, do not evaporate in the cool fluorescence of sound information. Resistant to obliteration, our symbols require reconsideration. They need both pruning and flourish. So I want to explore the wreck, to plumb madness's metaphorical world for redemptive possibilities. If we let it, madness might just purify us, upsetting our narrow order, recovering the latent wisdom in our folly, and restoring us to foolishness. The mad, the insane, the demented, the disabled, they unsettle us, the temporarily able, with their bald truth. And we need unsettling if we are ever to be anything but semi-conscious sleepers virtually brain dead to the world. We need to be saved from our own vapidity, from our own diminished spirits and vacant imaginations. King Lear's Fool, a prime representative of madness, reordering, punctures the pretenses of wealth and power, exposing the frailty that lies behind human facades. In a fit of petty rage and poor judgment, Lear recklessly disowns one of his daughters, the loyal Cordelia. His other daughters, the conniving Regan and Goneril, cast out their father after he gives them their inheritance. Lear's kingdom, his political and familial power, his mental and physical prowess, are all slipping away, anguished by his loss of stature and identity. Lear pleads, "Does anyone here know me? Who is it that can tell me who I am?" Despondent, the old monarch refuses to seek shelter during a violent storm. As rain pelts his head and thunder and lightning hem him in, he taunts the tempest, inviting its wrath. "Rage blow!" vaunt couriers of oak-cleaving thunderbolts. "Singe my white head!" Lear, however, is not alone in this storm. The fool stands beside him, and perhaps it is he who knows Lear and can tell him who he is, refusing to abandon the king. In his fit of suicidal rage, the fool tries to convince him to go inside. "Oh, nuncle, court holy water in a dry house is better than this rain. Water out, O door." Given his own small stature and humble estate, the fool is uniquely positioned to accept Lear in his folly, in his new stripped state. As Lear descends further into despair, the fool abides. In a moment of affection for the fool, and perhaps with a faint but growing recognition of his own folly, Lear says, The art of our necessities is strong. That can make vile things precious. Poor fool and knave, I have one part in my heart that's sorry yet for thee. The fool and the chastened king for once share a common lowly condition, and in this state vile things, such as the fool, become precious to Lear. He values the fool in a new way, not for what the fool can do for him, but for his loyal companionship. He that has a little tiny wit, sings the fool, must make content with his fortunes fit. Though the rain raineth every day, Lear pronounces the fool's jingle true. This affirmation provides a window into Lear's growing solidarity with those of small estate and perpetual misfortune, those of tiny wit, for whom it raineth every day. Lear, too, must learn contentment with such small fortunes. Lear's fool says only a few lines, appears infrequently, never receives a name beyond fool, and exits the play cryptically and abruptly to kill himself. Some scholars speculate. Obsolescence, it seems, marks the vocation of such fools. It is a little wonder that the fool is especially equipped to accept the bitter and broken king, that he alone bears witness to the Lear who confesses, I fear I am not in my perfect mind. In light of cognitive impairment, the Apostle Paul's declaration, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, becomes concrete. By the Apostle's logic, fools are not incidental to the holy. They are not reluctantly included in the kingdom. They are not welcome as an act of charity on behalf of the rest of the community. Rather, they are chosen. They are choice. They are choice as opposed to cast off, choice as opposed to burden, choice as opposed to no one important, or more to the point, as simply no one. Given a seat of honor, not a cup of bitterness, Paul's choice foolishness is marked by humility, offering nothing to the world but one's lowly estate, at the mercy of others. These fools possess no special power or privileges, finding companionship and meaning where others see only waste or nothing at all. Fool is not a slanderous term, but rather it indicates a kind of blessedness. Lear's fool, by this definition, is no vile thing. Mary, one of the residents I came to know at the gardens, comes to mind as a fool. In the positive Pauline sense, too, her acute anxiety on top of memory issues made getting out of bed a Herculean task each morning. When she finally did, she would often set to work helping her neighbors in wheelchairs get to activities and meals. Some days, Mary shook too violently to speak. I could often tell the emotional tenor of Mary's day by the accuracy of her lipstick application. The more the color strayed from her lips, the more anxious she was. She made a point to come to the weekly spirituality group I facilitated on the dementia unit. Sometimes she transported Vera in her wheelchair. One day we reflected on the Beatitudes by reading a contemporary rewriting of this series of blessings. From the Sermon on the Mount, the first line said, "Blessed are you when you don't have it all together." Mary, a crooked red line extending past her lips and halfway down her chin, immediately chimed in, "I must really be blessed then." She had the group in stitches. She keeps disarming me. In one of the first books on the spiritual needs of persons with dementia, a guide to the spiritual dimension of care for people with Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, more than body, brain, and breath, Eileen Shamey, also appeals to the value of the foolishness. A Methodist clergywoman, Shamey declares in the introduction that she hopes the book will bring together those who work with and love people who have dementia. She describes this communion as a fellowship of the foolish. For foolish we most certainly will appear, she writes, in a society obsessed by the quantifiable, by the immediate, by productivity and usefulness, by competition and profit, by individualism and loss of community, and where the bottom line really is the bottom line. In such a world, Shamey asserts, it is accounted madness to expend precious resources on those who, in economic terms, are useless. It is a scandalous fellowship, this fellowship of fools whose upside-down logic ordains the mad-minded, the weak-bodied, and the poor-spirited as bearers of divine wisdom. During my chaplaincy training, I learned about the Reverend Anton Boysen, who in the early 20th century found himself thrust into the fellowship of the foolish. Boysen enjoyed a rather ordinary, if peripatetic, early career in ministry. He did survey work for the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions, served 2 short-term pastorates, and worked as the congregational chaplain at Iowa State University. During World War I, he worked 2 years for the YMCA in France. None of these positions, however, represented Boysen's greatest contribution. His career took an extraordinary turn only after the pastor became the psychiatric patient. Boysen suffered 5 major periods of psychoses, what he called mental disturbances. During one of these episodes, his family had him committed to Westboro State Hospital in Massachusetts, where he remained for 15 months. His diagnosis was dementia praecox, what we now call schizophrenia. Boysen recalled the one time a psychiatrist agreed to speak with him. The doctor's pity response, "Nature must have its way," disheartened Boysen, who felt the psychiatrist had missed the spiritual depth and intricacies of his condition. The disappointed Boysen realized the physician had neither understanding nor interest in the religious aspects of my problem. The ministers who came to offer Sunday services for the patients of Westboro proved equally unhelpful. While they may have known something about religion, Boysen observed, they certainly knew nothing about our problems. One minister preached a series of sermons on the state of missionary activity in Africa and Asia. Another pastor preached on the text, "If thine eye offend thee, pluck it out." Boysen reflected, I was afraid that 1 or 2 of my fellow patients might be inclined to take that injunction literally. The patient's spiritual hungers were systematically misunderstood or denied. Boysen, however, listened to his fellow madmen and heard spiritual hunger. He listened to his own soul and heard divine echo in its ache. Writing from the confines of his hospital ward in 1921, Boysen responded to a friend's suggestion that he could recover only if he gave himself over to simple manual work. Hang the sanity. You can't ever make life worth living if all you're doing is to try to keep from going insane. Oof. Who can blame the friend who wished Boysen to busy himself with menial tasks in order to stay safely sane? The advice aimed to keep Boysen firmly away from foolishness, to keep his life small, ineffectual, faithless. After his recovery at Westboro, Boysen committed his work and study to better understanding and serving those who have been forced off the beaten path of common sense and have traveled through the little-known wilderness of the inner life. Reflecting on his new vocation, Boysen wrote, I am not afraid. I have always managed to find my way through, and I do think that in a very real sense I have been exploring some little-known territory which I should like now to have a chance to map out. With the help of his friend, Dr. Richard Cabot, a well-known physician who taught social ethics at seminaries in Boston, Boysen became the chaplain at Worcester State Hospital and began to bring seminary students inside psychiatric hospitals for a supervised experience with patients. Similar to the kind of practicum required of medical students, he wanted future ministers to encounter patients in all their complexity and potential within the clinical setting, and he wanted the patients to have their religious lives, that little-known wilderness of inner life, taken seriously. These seminary students were adept at studying the Bible and theological writings, but Boysen felt passionately that ministers need to learn to read a different kind of text, what he termed the living human document. They especially needed to learn to appreciate the themes, metaphors, and movements of the inner life. Boysen's experiment took hold, evolving into a transcontinental training program called Clinical Pastoral Education, CPE. I first heard of Boysen and his Living Human document during the first week of my first unit of CPE training. The summer I was assigned to the neurological unit. CPE, or some variation of it, is now a fixture in seminary curricula. Most major hospitals rely on CPE students and supervisors to provide spiritual care, and many denominations require their candidates for ordination to have at least some CPE training. An extensive board certification process for healthcare chaplains, which many hospitals require of their hires, entails the completion of CPE units. Boysen's program has moved beyond his original focus on psychiatric facilities, expanding into nearly every clinical environment. Origins nonetheless matter. Reflecting on Boysen's legacy, the theologian Robert Dijkstra wrote in 2005, "Pastoral theology was born of madness, and one could argue has yet to fully recover." When Boysen first began asking hospitals to allow in seminary students, he received pushback from skeptical hospital administrators. One superintendent, however, agreed to Boysen's proposal, saying he would let a horse doctor in if he thought it might help the patients. Ministers readily took their place alongside the horse doctor and the insane in the fellowship of the foolish. Perhaps recovery is not the goal. The Catholic priest and writer Henry Nouwen says a Christian leader is called to be completely irrelevant and to stand in this world with nothing to offer but his or her own vulnerable self. In a world full of peers who do things, or at least seem to do important things, to offer nothing but one's vulnerable self rings ridiculous. What exactly does a chaplain, a minister, a writer do anyway? By Nouwen's definition, it seems Christian leaders cast their lot with people who find themselves through no choice of their own made insignificant. Dwelling among the obscure, steeped in the fellowship of the foolish, the irrelevance, this foolishness is not born of naivete or ineptitude. It is not the irrelevance of a preacher updating chapel goers at a mental institution about global missions. It is the irrelevance of losing your life in order to find it. Madly without condition, if not having it all together. I now understand why I came to like working with people who have dementia. It is not because their pain is my pleasure, their suffering is not merely interesting to my otherwise boring life. Rather, all pretense ceases. Their own dependency lays bare my less visible needs for others, for help. Admitting my own limits strikes me as a gentler and more honest approach to life. In every age, it seems we want madness, however we define it at the time. To shut up, to turn vacant, to put on some clothes. We want to neutralize its danger and muzzle its unsettling truth. Boysen observed that the real evil in mental disorder is not to be found in the conflict, but in the sense of isolation and estrangement. I can't but think of our propensity to isolate and estrange persons with dementia. While we do not literally consign them to life in an asylum, they do tend to reside on the fringes of our families, congregations, neighborhoods, and nations, and on the fringes of public discourse. We need healing. We must look again at the ones we have handed over to the margins.